Now, this paper I'm about to read is part of an effort. Is part of an effort to build language to allow better cross-medium conversations about LARP. For example, say you want to run a 2-week-long LARP unit in a college course about new media, or a LARP studies course in general, where you're teaching LARP as literature. Or say you want to run a LARP as part of a festival, and the organizers just don't understand how LARP as a medium is any different than the immersive theater events that are already being run. How do you justify including LARP as its own media form? So part of the sort of shameless utilitarianism of this is, to be able to work towards having that cross-disciplinary language to really situate LARP in media studies. I use the language of narratology, semiotics, and ludology to draw analogies between LARP and other media to show what's unique about LARP. My central question here is, how is LARP its own medium? And as a medium in its own right, it is going to have its own literacy. So how does LARP literacy on the ground actually work? So let's see. I'm going to be talking about 3 basic elements of LARP literacy in this paper. Noise filtering, which I almost consider analogous to bookbinding in terms of LARP's media form. Direct diegesis, and gamified diegesis. And I would love to discuss these terms with people. These are like Jeanette's narratology, where I'm drawing these terms from. But in other communities, other writers have found different ways to situate these same activities within their discourses, and I'm excited for that cross-disciplinary discussion. All right, so time to really dive into this paper. So, LARP is an analog gaming medium through which players interact with a diegesis, or story world, both through acts that directly represent diegetic material and through the gamified deployment of diegetic signifiers. Diegesis is a term often used in film and media studies to refer to what might be thought of as the story world of a given piece of narrative media. The concept of diegesis is useful to those who engage in collaborative forms of storytelling, in which control over different parts of a narrative have been distributed to members of a team, such as in the creation of films and video games. When creating a film, for example, it is vital that many members of your storytelling team, the directors, the actors, the DP, the sound designer, the editors, are all in agreement about whether the music in a given scene they are co-creating is diegetic, so it's part of the stories and the characters can hear it, or if it is extradiegetic and only the audience can hear it. Like those screeching violins in a horror movie, if the character could hear them, they would not go through that door, because it's extradiegetic. Since the term diegesis is perhaps overly technical, you don't hear it thrown around on film sets a lot, but the concept certainly is. It's in all media studies textbooks that you have to hit if you're going into that field. And you'll hear diegesis thrown around in the form of questions like, can her character hear that? Or what's going to be put where that green screen is? They're talking about the story world there. They're talking about the diegesis. Rapid communication about what is happening in a diegesis is likewise important to those participating in the LARP media form, because perhaps even more so, because unlike filmmakers, LARPers do not merely co-create diegesis. They simultaneously experience it as spectators, which is to say, LARP is a form of narrative media that has no fourth wall, at least not in the traditional sense. It is not possible to distinguish between those creating the story and its audience. This phenomenon has been called first-person audience by Christopher Sandberg, and it occurs in both the LARP and tabletop mediums, the premier forms of analog role-playing game. But LARP distinguishes itself from the tabletop medium through the use of live-action theatrics and WYSIWYG props to convey narrative content. Additionally, because of this live-action requirement, LARP participants also experience what Mike Pagiola calls interimmersion. As described by Jaakko Stenros, interimmersion is the positive feedback loop of inhabiting the game world and the character. This interimmersive feedback loop creates the sense of being inside the very narrative diegesis you are co-creating and audiencing. So yeah, fourth wall is down. That that is our medium, to play this trifecta role as a narrative's co-creator, spectator, and diegetic inhabitant, a LARP participant must be LARP literate, which is to say, a LARP participant must be able to rapidly extract meaning from the signifiers through which the diegesis of the LARP, the signified, is conveyed. To the person who does not know how to read the diegetic signifiers of a given LARP, many parts of this activity will appear to them as a cacophony of nonsensical human behaviors. There is LARP literacy, and there's also LARP illiteracy. That is a thing. And many of us may remember moments of gaining LARP literacy as adults, which is very fun to talk about. So this is why attempts to film LARP-generated narrative for a non-LARP literate audience have been largely unsuccessful. Also, attempts to use actual LARP gameplay as media content for a non-participating audience, I argue, undermines the architecture of LARP. Some LARP makers, for example, have created experimental media pieces that are structured a lot like LARP, but in which the game's narrative content is rendered viewable to non-participating spectators. While these media pieces deserve to be looked at and celebrated in their own right, I do not believe they should be called LARP. LARP's lack of architecture for rendering a medium viewable to a non-participating audience is by necessity a key part of its architecture. You don't want to put a fourth wall in there. We'll talk about this maybe in the Q&A. But additionally, while there isn't time to adequately discuss the many forms that LARP has taken in the 40-odd years since the medium was more or less formally codified, it is really worth noting, or it is really worth taking a moment to emphasize that very different LARP communities around the world have found very different ways to structure LARP. And whatever you think LARP is, there's probably something out there that will turn your idea of LARP on its head. New forms of structuring LARP and of gamifying the co-creation of diegesis are sprouting up all the time. So, getting to the question of LARP literacy, how do LARP participants read the signifiers of diegetic material while simultaneously audiencing, co-creating, and experiencing the things of that diegesis? So, getting to the fun stuff. All right, so the first element of LARP literacy I'm going to talk about is what I call direct diegesis. LARP is prided on being the live action form of RPG. A common feature of all LARPs is that at least some of the game's narrative content is generated through live action theatrics and WYSIWYG props. So these things are to be read as directly diegetic. So while LARPing, I might literally walk up to another player, make an in-character proclamation that, you sir, you stole that watch, you stole that pin that you're holding. And at that moment, when we're having that interaction, we're taking that in game. It's WYSIWYG. This part of LARP literacy is very easy. We know it from theater. The things unfolding right in front of you, that's actually the diegesis. This element of LARP isn't very different than the sort of live action impromptu content generation that happens in immersive theater, walkabout performance art, and historical reenactment. What sets LARP apart from these other media forms is that LARP also has gamified diegesis. But before we talk about some ways gamified diegesis appears, here's another element to LARP literacy that I want to draw your attention to. I'm going to try to make this quick. So noise filtering. Borrowing and expanding upon the concept of noise to signal ratio from telecommunications engineering, sort of where I'm working to find terms here to really plug this into other forms of media analysis. We might consider the most basic skill for any type of literacy to be the ability to distinguish between noise and signal. So while listening to a radio broadcast, this entails the ability to distinguish between the radio show, which is considered signal, and the moments of crackling static, the noise that might interrupt the show as your car weaves along a mountainous road with reception fading in and out. So to extend that into another media form, let's say we're talking about noise and signal in the book medium. So the wrinkles on the page, those are noise. You're reading a book in a cafe, people talking next to you, that's noise. It's so easy to figure out where the signal is. It's being conveyed by the signifiers on the page. But with LARP, because we lack that fourth wall architecture, because we lack that sort of item that you're focusing on to get story, differentiating where the noise is and where the signal is isn't going to be so simple. And I got the 5-minute mark there, so I'm going to kind of go fast through this and just, gesture towards the fact that our noise filtering conventions in LARP are in this very funny place. And if you have no standardization yet, you go between communities, you might say on game, off game. Quick show of hands, in your LARP community, what are some ways that you signal that you're out of game? All these different gestures. Or I might take a weapon and go like this. I might say off game, I might say out of game, I might say out of character. And depending on the community you're in, you might actually have people get a little angry if you use the wrong gesture, which is very fascinating, a very fascinating element to LARP culture. But you look at the development of the early book, and you find, oh look, book bindings, they opened in the middle sometimes. You had these codexes, you had weird folds and scrolls, and when the book medium was really finding its feet, everyone redesigned the book in a bespoke way with every book they made. And LARP as a medium is in this really exciting place where noise filtering, it happens in every LARP, but we haven't yet standardized it. And let me see, so the fact that noise filtering conventions have emerged independently all over the globe that are analogous within every LARP community shows the significance noise filtering plays in our medium. The noise filtering conventions in LARP are like the opposite of a fourth wall. Rather than looking at a screen or page or wall separating you from the diegesis, what you're looking at when you see a noise filtering convention, when you see this, is a type of edge, but you are looking at the edge of the diegesis from within. So, diegesis. I'm going to go very fast through this. So, let's see. So, every LARP maker is likely to use a combination of gamification tactics to render parts of their diegesis playable. In the paper, I work to really delineate what's going on from a narratological perspective in each of these types of gamified diegesis. And my caveat is that, it shouldn't be treated as a standardization. So, extradiegetic statement exchange, or EAS, when sort of workshopping some of the basic concepts in this with Marcus Montola, who I'd say in his 2012 dissertation really worked to delineate what I call EAS as a type of act. You must become literate in EAS to understand when it is going on. Montola found 3 types of illocutionary statements were happening in occasions of EAS: assertions, directives, and declarations. I guess I have an example of EAS happening right here, and I'm getting the, I'm just gonna have to go through my slides and then cut to the chase. But in my work with the Humanities and Critical Code Studies Lab, part of our work is to go through coded moments and annotate them. So, some of the efforts for this paper have been, to take a moment and say, wow, those who are literate in EAS in LARP know how to differentiate between an extradiegetic statement and a directly diegetic statement in these rather complex ways. And folks don't go into the game situation knowing this in advance. This is a prime way of communicating and co-creating diegesis in LARP, tabletop, and it emerged in the 1960s. Text-based games is where you really start seeing it coming together in the form that we use it today. Extradiegetic things. So these are some of the most controversial ways that LARP Diegesis is co-created. But let me see. So am I going to have time to make any of the points I want? So intradiegetic things include designated behaviors, speech acts, and objects that have a predetermined diegetic effect other than how they appear, which means folks have to memorize them and workshop them ahead of time. So if you have a game that has 200 intradiegetic objects, you're going to drive your player base a little crazy, but we do that all the time in LARP, so. Let's see. So they may alter logistical values that pertain to a character's ability to move through and exercise autonomy within the game, or they might not. In video game culture, interdiegetic things always do that, but video games are a very different medium. We have Arzamondi in Nordic LARP culture, an interdiegetic way of representing sexual relations between characters in which you're touching each other's arms, hands, and neck while describing like intimate physical relations between your characters. And that is an example of an intradiegetic thing that doesn't link to diegetic code. I talked about this 2 years ago. By exposing students to these different types of diegetic gamification and encouraging them to reflect, we will deepen their game literacy. A high level of game literacy, I argue, is a vital feature of an educated populace and a well-functioning democracy. For LARP makers, understanding LARP literacy will aid them in selecting or inventing the techniques to gamify co-creation of diegesis for their projects. LARP, we shouldn't standardize modes of gamifying diegesis, maybe noise filtering, but not the gamifying of diegesis yet. LARP is only 50 years old. We have new modes of this always emerging. So that's my caveat to this talk, and to the forthcoming paper. Don't use this as a guideline where it's like, this is how you do LARP. It's like, no, these are how people have done LARP. Let's keep building these tactics. So I'm excited to work to apply this language to real-world decision-making processes, which I treat as a form of future-oriented media in which speculative nonfiction is created about what we'll do next. So LARP is an excellent sort of launching point to talk about political economy, which is what I'm going to be working on with my PhD. And if you would like to talk to me, take a photo of that, that's my email address. See you guys at the conference.
In Maria Lugones' paper, Playfulness, World Traveling, and Loving Perception, she begins her introduction. This paper weaves two aspects of life together: my coming to consciousness as a daughter and my coming to consciousness as a woman of color have made this weaving possible. Similarly, this paper attempts to weave together two aspects of my own scholarly life: feminist theorizing and the field of game studies. As I was putting this paper together, I wanted to throw everything in the kitchen sink into this paper, as I'm sure my fellow academics will understand. And then I started thinking about the fact that I really only have 15 minutes to give this talk. So I decided instead, rather than to try to cover everything in 15 minutes, I was going to really narrow my focus down. So what I'm going to be talking about today is one specific theoretical piece. And it's a specific theoretical piece that I feel like has contributed a lot to my thinking about games, game design, game studies, how I teach games in the classroom. So this is Lugones' piece, Playfulness, World Traveling, and Loving Perception, which was written in 1987. And I read Lugones originally in a graduate feminist theory class. And I know I read it because I have some notes in the book, but it didn't really make much of an impression on me until I went back to the piece when I was teaching my own feminist theory class at Mount Holyoke College. By this point in time, I had become much more immersed in the world of games. I had designed my own games, I'd written some scholarly papers about games, and all of a sudden, Lugones' piece took on a completely different aspect for me, because she managed to crystallize and describe and conceptualize things that I had been thinking about in my own scholarly work, in my own game design work, in ways that I had not seen before. And And so part of what this presentation aims to do is to introduce 3 of the main concepts that Lugones uses in this piece: the concept of world and world traveling, the concept of playfulness, and the concept of loving perception, and think about them in terms of game studies. How can we use these concepts when we're studying and talking about games, but also how might these concepts be useful as we're thinking about specifically designing games that are meant to put people in others' shoes or promote the kind of learning that's about changing your perception, understanding things differently, challenging the way that you understand the world, right? And these are all things that, to me, are really, really important aspects of games and game design. So Lugones is theorizing playfulness specifically through a feminist woman of color lens. And the other reason that I wanted to focus on Lugones in this paper is because I'd really like to integrate her more centrally into game studies scholarship. I feel like she has a lot to add. She brings a very different perspective. So those are sort of my goals with this presentation today. So I'm asking, how can Lugones' theories of playfulness, world traveling, and loving perception be integrated into game studies? What can her theories contribute to how we think about LARPs and learning? All right, so as I mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on 3 key concepts that Lugones touches on in this piece. The first is her definition of worlds and world traveling. Next is her definition of playfulness. And finally, her definition of loving perception, which for her is the goal of the world traveling and the playfulness. All right, so when Lugones is talking about a world, what exactly is she talking about? So her first point is that a world must be inhabited by flesh and blood people. A world is not a utopia, she says. And I'm going to come back to this because I think this has some really interesting implications when we are talking about LARP and flesh and blood people inhabiting fantastical co-created worlds. But a world is in many ways similar to a community. A world shares language and norms. A world is somewhere where many of the people approve of these norms, but perhaps not all people do. Worlds tend to have affectionate ties between members, and worlds endow their inhabitants with a common history and common knowledge. And Lugones points out that worlds can be quite large, or they can be quite small. There might be a world made up of a couple of people that are very close friends and have been friends for a very long time and have these very affectionate ties and common history and shared language and norms. Or there may be these larger worlds. The other thing that Lugones points out about worlds that is, again, very important for the concept of LARP and role-playing in both the sort of diegetic and extradiegetic discussions is that people act differently in different worlds, right? So Lugones has a whole discussion of how she started writing this paper because she didn't know if she was a playful person or not. She wanted to think of herself as a playful person, but she secretly worried that she was not a playful person. And so she began to ask people, am I a playful person? Do you think I'm a playful person? And she said, what I found was I got these very, very different answers. Some people said, well, of course, you're a totally playful person. Like, that's who you are. And then other people said, oh no, you're very serious. You're not playful at all. And that was how she came to this concept of worlds. Worlds where she felt at ease. Maria Lugones was a very playful person. But in other worlds, that she felt less at ease. She did not feel safe. She did not have the ability to be playful. And so she points out that people have different comfort levels in different worlds. In some worlds, they feel very at ease, they feel very safe, they feel very comfortable interacting with other people. And in other worlds, they may be very guarded. They may be very serious. They may hold back a lot of aspects of themselves. And one of the things that she talks about in this concept of world traveling is that for people from marginalized groups, world traveling is often not voluntary, right? That as a woman of color, she is often asked to travel to these other worlds where she doesn't feel at ease, but she doesn't see the same traveling coming back, right? That for many white and Anglo women, traveling to her world doesn't happen. And so part of what she's talking about in this piece is encouraging this world traveling, right? Getting people to travel to worlds where they're not at ease, particularly people who don't have to do this, right? For whom this traveling is going to be a voluntarily go somewhere where you feel uncomfortable. And how to encourage that. And again, for me, this is a real central goal of LARP, right? To get people to travel to those places where they're learning something new. And they maybe are learning something new about themselves, but they're also learning about other people. They're learning about people different than themselves. They're learning about their own perceptions of others. They're traveling to these different worlds. And she says, we need to be careful, right? That there are worlds that we enter at our own risk, right? Worlds that have agon, that have conquest, that have arrogance as the main ingredients of their ethos. And these are not worlds we want to travel to lightly, right? She says sometimes we don't have a choice. We've got to go to these worlds whether we like it or not. But that when we are traveling playfully, part of that is constructing a world where we are able to be playful, right? Where we're able to open ourselves to this experience, open ourselves to what she terms loving perception. All right, so playfulness. Play and playfulness is sort of a central topic of discussion and debate within the game studies world. And Lugones has her own particular take on it. She rejects constructions of playfulness that are rooted in this idea of competence and mastery. She rejects constructions of playfulness that rely on a fixed conception of self. And she rejects constructions of playfulness that engage in agonistic travel, right? So this is the idea of traveling with sort of a colonialist mindset, right? I'm gonna go, I'm gonna see this world, I'm gonna master this world, I'm gonna win this world, and then I'm gonna leave, right? And for her, this world traveling is about opening yourself up, right? It's not about competence, it's much more actually about figuring out that you don't know things. And now that you're in this new world, you're seeing things differently, right? And she says a playful attitude turns an activity into play. So this playful attitude, she says, is about openness to surprise, openness to self-construction, the idea that no rules are sacred, the idea that when you are in this playful mindset, you're there creatively and actively, that there is no passive play, that you're actively engaged in this creation and this traveling. And one of the things that I find really, like, for me when I read this, I was like, oh yeah, this is playfulness, right? It's finding ambiguity and double edges as sources of wisdom and delight. And that statement for me is the power of games, right? That games can create this world where ambiguity and double edges can be a source of wisdom and delight. So, the goal of this, according to Lugones, is the development of what she terms loving perception. Loving perception, she discusses as the opposite of what she terms arrogant perception. And arrogant perception is very much the act of othering another group or an individual from another group. It's turning the other or the outsider into an object, right? And so loving perception is the act of seeing the other, the outsider, as a subject rather than an object. And she says, until you have traveled to the other's world, you cannot truly understand them as a subject. which again, powerful stuff for LARP and doing this kind of perception-changing stuff that I think a lot of us are interested in. So this playfulness and world traveling allows you to see that members of these other social groups have complex, subjective, and agentic lives that are denied in the world where they are not at home, right? And loving perception is about learning how we are perceived in other worlds, but also how these other people are perceived in other worlds, right? So again, this idea that having this kind of world traveling, having this playfulness and openness to surprise and reconstructing the self also helps us to challenge this othering and objectifying of other people. Okay, so quickly, I'm going to talk a little bit about potentials I see for this in terms of game studies and LARP studies. So I feel like Lugones' definition of playfulness is particularly useful for LARPs. I remember reading Solon and Zimmerman, and they're like, role-playing games, they are not really games. And having this moment where I was like, but those are the only games I play. But I think that this, again, this idea of playfulness as being, you know, it's not about rules, it's not about competence, it's not about mastery. You know, there are goals, but they're not goals in the way that we generally tend to think about them when we're talking about games. And if we think about sort of the different definitions of play, this one falls much more in the sort of experiential, you know, openness to learning that comes with the experience, right? Which I think, again, when we're thinking about LARPs, and particularly the kind of LARPs that are meant to challenge our perceptions and help us to sort of learn in ways that expand our thinking, it's a very useful definition. Another thing that I think is interesting is thinking about creating spaces where players can be playful, right? And her talking about this concept of worlds where she doesn't feel at ease, where she can't be playful, where, you know, you enter them at your own risk. I think that's another useful concept when we think about how do we create game spaces that allow all our participants to be playful, that really create the space for this world traveling, right? You know, how do games allow for ambiguity and double edges? How can ambiguity and double edges be useful in educational and learning contexts? I think this ability to sort of sit with ambiguity, to understand double edges, can be very, very useful. And again, are something that I think LARP is particularly well situated to help us do for participants. How do games foster loving perception as opposed to arrogant perception? Are there design elements we can identify that lead to one over the other, and what might those be? And then this idea of worlds as having to be inhabited by flesh and blood people. And this idea of, does LARP count? If these flesh and blood people are characters, if they're fictional creations, does that count as a world, right? And what is the difference between the diegetic world that's created within the game and the extradiegetic world that's created as part of the game, right? And how can we use the concepts of worlds to discuss both of these, right? Are we creating a safe world in which the game is taking place? And then what kind of diegetic world are we creating with our narrative and game fiction, right? All right, so I'm going to leave you with those provocative questions, and hopefully you will have more questions for me or things that we'd like to build on. I would really love to see other people take this piece up and engage with it. You can find it in Hypatia. This is the piece that I've been talking about. It's also been anthologized in multiple other feminist anthologies. And if you are interested in contacting me after the conference, this is my contact information, and I would be happy to hear from you. So thank you all very much.
So I realize we're short on time, so I'm going to try to go really big picture. I'm going to rush through a lot of my slides. I'm trying to get to the end where I talk about a couple of vignettes that I think will really illustrate what I'm talking about. My goal is to talk about what I'm doing right now, why I thought it was a good idea, and why I'm hypothesizing that it's working so well. and then how you might be able to do something similar if you're interested in doing something like this yourselves. So, again, I'm going to try to go really quickly, so we're going to almost skip this slide. I want to emphasize that the central hypothesis here is that games, and specifically narrative games, games that include stories like role-playing games and live-action role-playing games, give really great opportunities to naturally develop social-emotional skills. That's sort of the hypothesis that really is what drives it here. I'll talk a little bit about why I think it works that way. He already told you about who I am. I am working at Master General Hospital's Aspire program, primarily with autistic teens. Thank you for giving the autism intro. My original rough draft of this was 15 minutes of me explaining autism, and then I would have just walked off the stage. So that's so much better. You did a wonderful job with it. I'll be using identity-first language, which is the consensus of the autistic teens that I'm working with. So I'll be saying autistic. So really, the point of this is to talk about why these games work, how I chose to create this game. I tried to use a couple of other systems when I started. I was using Dungeons & Dragons. It took 8 hours to make characters. They wanted to change their characters. It was really complicated. We were doing too much math. I was working with 4th graders. It was really cumbersome. So I decided I was going to try to make my own game. A couple things that make Guild Chronicles, I think, a good game to use. I'm not trying to sell it, but I think some great ways that you could design games to do the same thing. It's really simple to start, but it has a lot of options and a lot of flexibility. So it's easy to start, but the guys that get really obsessed with rules and really want to look at it, they keep finding more from it. And I think that's really important in a game like this. Especially with this is sort of also the kind of Asperger's profile that I work with. So these guys are really smart. They get really interested in data. So if they can't keep power gaming it, keep coming up with new ideas, they're getting bored with it. I also have a parallel set of rules that's really, really simple. It's almost free of math. It's very easy to use. Everything exists on a single piece of paper, and the font size is like 18 or bigger. Instead of like having hit points where you have to do math, you just cross out boxes and erase them when you get healed. Those two systems, though, can play together. So if I've got one guy that really doesn't have a lot of academic skills, he can be playing just as powerful of a character, just as interesting as a character, as the guy that's read the 50-page rulebook 20 times and is trying really hard to power game. All right. It's being used right now in schools and, well, it's being used in one school right now. I had a couple schools that were using it. It's really difficult to get these things off the ground, because if you're not a gamer, it's really hard to facilitate a game that really is a complex role-playing game at its heart. I am doing work at Master General Hospital's Aspire program. I've worked with about 100 teens. I'm doing some ongoing action research that's really informal, and I really want to do more research and look at some evidence, try to gather some good data. So really, why do I think this works? So really, the heart of it is that people learn best by doing. So we've moved away from sort of the lecture where I explain how eye contact works and what is socially expected about eye contact. 10 years ago, you would have heard people like lecturing people about how to do that. Now we talk about why we use eye contact, when you might choose to use it. It's much more nuanced, and practicing it is really the only way to actually get better at anything. With autistic folk, this is doubly true. A difficulty with generalization is something that's kind of core to the autistic profile. That means that it might be really easy for them to interact and talk with me. They've got a good social relationship with me, but you ask them to do that somewhere else, or if they see me at the restaurant and they're trying to have an interaction with me, it's really, really difficult. Also really high interest, he touched on this really well. It is something they really care passionately about. So that gives me two things. That gives me their willingness to put in a lot of effort to work on these difficult things. I'm asking them to be collaborative, to be flexible, to socialize, to do all these things that are hard for them, but they're willing to do it because they all have this shared goal of killing the dragon, getting the treasure, whatever it is that they've decided that they want to take, they're willing to do it. It also makes it really easy for them to connect. Having a shared interest makes it really easy to start a friendship. Everyone here has experienced that. But having a shared experience together, an adventure that you've gone on, a story that you can tell around the campfire later, it's a very LARP experience in my past. They get that same experience playing the game with me. So they get to sort of build a friendship really easily with these tools. Finally, playing the game has high demands. It makes it really challenging for them to do these things. I'm going to skip forward a couple slides. if you would like my slides, I put a lot of words on them because I wanted someone that couldn't follow what I was saying out loud to be able to read it later. You can write down your email address and I'll send you the whole slide deck. It's much easier. It's going to make it as faster. But I wanted to talk about so we know we've got this. So this is something I think is an important point. The other part that's present is I'm the facilitator. I'm a part of this group. So I'm acting as the storyteller. That's what I call it in Guild Chronicles. It's the dungeon master, whatever it is, the game master. I'm acting as the storyteller. So I'm providing this narrative, but I'm also providing, I'm a coach, I'm a referee sometimes when chaos is breaking out in the group. I'm doing all of these things to support social interactions being successful. So if you've got supported interactions, you're going to have more successful interactions. That's going to make you feel good about what you're doing, right? So then you're going to feel successful, you're going to feel competent, and you're going to think, oh, I could try that again, or oh, this is kind of fun, maybe I want to do that more. You build up your social motivation, which is then going to give you more opportunities to have success, to have more interactions. So this is a really good positive feedback loop. I didn't put the negative one in here. It's not a good one, but if all you have is failures and confusion and chaos, your social motivation is going to go down, you're going to have less chances to practice. So this is sort of one of the ways that the intervention really happens. It's not just that we play the game, but it's being led by someone that's really consciously thinking about the kids, thinking about supporting them. Skipping forward a little further. Why is it hard to play a role-playing game? Probably most of you know this, but I just put up 3 quick examples that I've actually put my kids in this position, and it's a really fun social experiment that I enjoy way too much. But like, they kill the boss, there's 5 of them in the group, and they get 3 magic items. Everybody wants the same one, it's the most powerful one. Nobody wants the little cast-off one. But watching them try to negotiate and figure that out, and hey, you know, maybe you could have it, but maybe next time I would get first choice. There's all these different ways that I think a lot of us take for granted that we're able to negotiate those social interactions that are so hard. And you've probably all had like gaming groups blow up because of some of these things too. This is it. So another example, I could not get a kid to go apologize to their mom to save my life. That would not happen. But if they go on a mission, it goes sideways, and they know that they need this captain of the guard to give them more missions later. They need to figure out how to apologize, how to mend their reputation with him, how to get back in his good graces. So they're going to practice apologizing. And while they're doing that, I might even pause the game, give them a little feedback, tell them, when you're apologizing that way, it kind of sounds like you're blaming other people. And I'm thinking, if all you're going to do is blame someone, I don't really think I could trust them again next time. So then they have to rethink it, go back. So there is sort of, I do kind of step outside of the game every once in a while, that extradiegetic thing, but it's a way to give feedback. And I even sometimes let them time warp back and try it again. Because that, I mean, I wish the world was that forgiving, but I can't, because I'm the god of this strange little world that we create together. Also just the intersocial stuff that's going on in the group as extradiegetic people, we have our own conflicts. They need to navigate those too. Someone's maybe getting really frustrated, they throw their die, they get up from the table, they leave for a while, trying to get that person to rejoin the group. All of those things are chances to practice these skills. All right, and that's why we play these games. So one question that I was really thinking about early on is what makes a game better suited for learning. Again, I'm going to try to go through it quickly, but I created a game that rewarded cooperation. I tried to think, like, just to give a couple examples, instead of having like really concrete, like you can make your own power gamed character where every power you choose makes you better, I balance it so that if you're choosing pro-social things to help your team, the scaling of the game is rewarding that much, much better. So you might get a +10 damage to your whole group in total at the cost of like a +1 damage for yourself. So it very quickly pays off. I make it transparent, I tell them this, and then they look for this kind of way to be pro-social in their game. Okay, so the last question, how do you employ narrative to really make this more powerful? So I want to illustrate this, I think, by just giving you 2 quick vignettes. I think that's the best way to do this. The first vignette is about an agender teen that joined my group. If you don't know agender, this teen does not really identify with any gender. Male, female, they're not into that. They have a very clear point, they have a very clear understanding of who they are, it just does not relate to gender. When I met them, they really struggled to advocate for the correct use of their pronouns. They use they, them, and their. I should say, really quickly, these names are made up, and I have obscured some details because it would be really inappropriate to just tell you about a person, really, that I'm working with, if that wasn't evident. But no, Riley, I'll call him Riley. Riley is energetic, quirky, amazing, brilliant, so smart, so thoughtful, and such a pleasure to work with. When I met them, it was at an intake session, so this is the first time I meet a person that I might work with. I had a female name on an application. I had a female, I had a mother introduce me using female pronouns. So in my head, I was speaking to a female. I spent the entire intake session misgendering them. And all that they did was mutter something quietly under their breath that I couldn't hear. And it was literally the last minute of this intake session where I heard them say the word they. Thank God I was like informed enough about gender that I was like, oh my God, what have I done? I was able to apologize to them, but I felt terrible. But it gave me an insight into what a goal could be for this person. So I recognized that they didn't have the skill necessary to advocate for themselves. So I had a goal, something that I thought we might be able to work on with them. So I started thinking, how can I bring that into the story? So I put another gender non-conforming character into the story. They met this character at a school, a very familiar setting to them, in a lunchroom, a very scary setting for them. And they were sitting at a table by themselves. Their lunch had been knocked over by somebody. Immediately, all of these kids quickly empathized with them and wanted to help this person. But their gender expression was all over the place. They were wearing kind of like a long robe that looked more like a dress. They had short hair. They had all these things that made it really difficult to kind of guess what their gender would be. So they went up, and knowing about gender, they asked them, you know, what pronouns do you use? And they, in the game, responded, oh, thank God you asked me. Nobody ever asks me. And then they, as a group, got to try to figure out a way to help this character advocate for themselves. So when they heard this character getting misgendered by other people in the story, they then had a chance to go and say, hey, they use they, them, their pronouns. So with that, and a lot of other support and direct instruction, this team, Riley, became their own best advocate. They got really good at doing this. They, after this point, another non-binary teen joined the group. He actually transitioned female to male during the group. So Riley got to help them start to learn to advocate for their pronouns to be used correctly. I don't have time to do my second vignette. That's okay. I do want us to be able to have time to get to questions. But if you want to know more and you want to talk to me or you want my slide deck, I'd be happy to share it. Thank you guys so much. I'll get to you.
Do you have any questions that they'd like to go over? Okay.
Hey, hi, I'm Rebecca Slitt. My question is for Kat. You mentioned design elements that foster loving perception. I'm really curious about that. Can you give us some examples of what those design elements might be?
Well, I think I have some ideas, but I don't want to present it as if like I have all the answers, because I think that it's a really interesting question, and I think one that has been talked about a lot, maybe not in a specific way, but this sort of idea of like, what kind of characters do people create for games? Who can create certain characters? Who can play certain characters? And for me, I mean, I think that their loving perception is a concept that helps us think about when are characters perpetuating stereotypes, when are characters used as objects in games as opposed to being subjects. And I think one of the strengths of role-playing games is that you can create characters that are complex, that challenge stereotypes and that challenge these sort of objectified views, and that have agency, right? And that you can really sort of delve into this idea of perceiving a whole person as opposed to perhaps perceiving someone that is just this very like two-dimensional stereotype.
Thank you.
Hey, Daniel Gomez. This question's for Andrew.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with the group of players and they're trying to get them to apologize, for example,
Yeah.
you said you come out of role to explain something. Did you ever try doing it in role?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think as often as possible, I try to stay in role. For example, we at one of our last sessions, I do this activity where I kind of get them to all reflect with each other about like positive things and positive impressions they made on each other. So I used to do that. I used to step outside and be Andrew and do that. And so like, you know, Bob, tell Jim what you thought about him. I decided this year that I was going to do that as the headmaster of the school. And it was much more powerful for them. They were way more willing to share stuff. It also let them, if they were a little unsure, they could share something that they liked about the character they played with. Even if they couldn't think of something nice to say about the human, they could say, oh, you know, you healed me the whole time and I would have died without you. So no, it's a good consideration. That yeah, I think as often as possible I try to stay as a character. But sometimes I just need to be me and remind them that we're also humans in space too. It's a great question.
Hi. So in light of what Kat had to present, I was looking. Oh, sorry. My name's Jason Cox. In light of what Kat had to say, I wanted to look back at your work that you presented. And it's lovely, great stuff about diegesis, but most of it exists within a certain amount of binary. It is or is not. We accept it or we reject it. And I'm wondering how playful ambiguity comes to play within that concept of where we are not entirely sure of things. And if you thought much about that.
You know, it's interesting because in the full version of that paper, which is 75% longer, is why I guess you don't write the paper ahead of time, just reading your notes. I write a bit about pervasive LARP, which Marcus Montola brilliantly covers in his 2012 dissertation, and pervasive gaming. I know we have Albert Kong, I'm not sure if he's in the room or not, from the San Francisco Play Society here, but pervasive gaming, there is a way that the signifiers for what is diegetic are made to be somewhat flexible, and this can be very useful both if you want to create like a really exciting, sort of action-adventure LARP through a major city with like spies or something, or if you're doing an activist LARP, there was an exciting one called We Are Citizens that occurred in Belarus, where folks LARPed as homeless people during a time after the anti-parasite laws were passed in 2015. So suddenly you had LARPers LARPing on the streets as homeless people in a region where it was literally illegal to be homeless. So it's like you can say, all right, like the pervasive conditions of your environment, you're reading those as diegesis, you're reading people's reactions to your character in character, so you can play with where the edge of the proverbial magic circle is, or where your fourth wall edge, whatever it is you want to call that thing that isn't in game is, and you can say, okay, anyone who walks up to my homeless character and interacts with them, I'm going to take that in game. So there is a lot of flexibility, which I think makes LARP into an even more exciting art form. I realize like there are some very firm terms that I'm laying out, but they're quite a bit more flexible than folks would assume once that literacy is sort of established. So thanks for asking.
And unfortunately, we're